It's time for a new nature movement, which encompasses but goes beyond traditional definitions of environmentalism and sustainability. This movement describes a very different future, one predicated on hope. Today, most Americans, at least, imagine what the far future will look like, and they see images of Blade Runner, Mad Max, or Cormac McCarthy's The Road, a post-apocalyptic dystopia filled with human brutality and stripped of nature. Now, why is that the dominant image of the future? Certainly in our movies. I think it's the one that most of us think of first when we think of the far future. We used to see a good future. We used to be optimistic. Popular culture, and for that matter, academic and journalistic culture, seem drawn to that flame. For decades, our culture has struggled with two addictions, to oil and to despair. But what if our lives were as immersed in nature as they are in technology every day? What if we not only conserved nature, but created it where we live, work, learn, and play? We can, in fact, I believe, create a very different future, and the stakes are enormous. Environmentalism is in trouble. This is not to say that environmentalism has failed. In fact, it's easy to forget that rivers that once caught fire now produce healthy fisheries. My parents thought nothing when I was growing up of throwing bags of trash out the window as we went down the road. Remember that? It wasn't that long ago. In Kansas City, where I grew up, you'd go past streams and rivers, and you'd always see cars, old cars that had been dumped over the side of the bank. You don't see that anymore. It's easy to forget how effective environmentalism has been and how many successes there have been at a certain level. At the local level, conservation, where its quality remains more personal, is relatively healthy. But the national organizations are struggling. And they know this. I've met many of the leaders of the major environmental organizations and the national ones recently, and they know that there is a problem. Poll after poll show that Americans seem to care less and less about the environment. Concern about pollution and other environmental challenges in some areas is at its lowest point since Earth Day 1970. It almost seems that the more we talk about climate change, the lower it ranks in the list of public priorities. Partly this is due to the recession and a well-financed campaign of disinformation, but it's also due, I believe, to the absence of a powerful, positive, nature-based vision of the future. Meanwhile, traditional connections to nature are vanishing quickly, along with biodiversity. We see this not only in the US, but in developing countries as well. Since Last Child in the Woods was published, what I would consider the first denatured generation has entered adulthood. At the same time, a new mythology of technology is suggesting that nature doesn't matter anymore. We even hear talk of the transhuman or post-human or post-biological era in which people are optimally enhanced by technology. Nature isn't in that vision. And I would argue that we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. We haven't even really explored fully what the natural world does to enhance us and can do more of. Technology will continue to grow, so will urbanism. In 2008, for the first time in history, more people in the world live in cities than in the countryside. Now, we went over that hump in somewhere around the 1940s in the United States, but now the whole world has gone over that hump. That's a very important moment in human history, and it's going to continue. What this means is that if human beings are going to have a meaningful relationship with the natural world, that relationship will likely take place in urban areas. But this will mean one of two things. Either the end of nature experience for human beings, the virtual end, or it will mean the beginning of a new kind of city. You're living in a hint of what that new kind of city could be, more than many cities. We need a bigger tent, or rather a new river to gather for us. Science is nourishing the headwaters of this river. An expanding body of evidence links the human experience in the natural world to better physical health and enhanced cognitive abilities, including but extending beyond environmentalism and sustainability. New branches of this river reach outward. Among them, biophilic design of new homes, neighborhoods, cities, reconciliation, ecology, and the valuing of what I call human nature social capital. A natural health system prescribing green exercise in which park rangers and others become nature paraprofessionals. This is actually happening in Portland. It may be happening here. Ecopsychology and other forms of nature therapy. Place-based learning, the whole communities movement, slow food and organic gardening, the walkable cities movement, and the movement to reconnect children with the outdoors. When seen as one force, these movements and others will create, as I said, a very different future. A new nature movement promises more than energy efficiency. It promises a larger sense of kinship with other species and with each other. It's about improving our health and our ability to learn. It's not just about survival, it's about thrival. It's about building a better civilization than the one we have now. Not just sustaining, not just surviving. The more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. As I write in the Nature Principle, the skeptic will say that this nature prescription is problematic, given our quickening destruction of nature. And the skeptic will be right. The natural world's benefits to our cognition and health will be irrelevant if we continue to destroy the nature around us. But that destruction is assured without a human reconnection to nature. Martin Luther King said in many ways that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to. I think we've been failing up until recently in the painting of that picture. We have been addicted to despair. We have been moving ever closer to that image of Blade Runner or Mad Max. We have to replace that image in our minds, in our culture. I think that we're already beginning to paint that picture. I think many of you are doing that every day in your work. I think the Children in Nature movement is, in a sense, kind of a canary in the mine shaft in reverse. Because it has shown in a very few years how something can grow. It's a little bit like the anti-smoking movement. I mean, that was, historically, that was virtually overnight. Well, the Children in Nature movement has moved quickly. There are now over 80 regional campaigns to get kids outdoors in the United States and Canada. There's a lot going on overseas. I'm spending more of my time in the UK and Australia and other places. If you go to the Children in Nature Network website, and Martin LeBlanc is here, he'll tell you more about that later, you'll be amazed, as I am, at how many great things are happening all over the country. The emergence of nature preschools, of more of them. There were a few before, but now they're starting to catch on. So are family nature clubs. Family nature clubs is an idea that, again, pre-existed our interest in it. But about 3 years ago, a father and second grade teacher emailed me from Roanoke, Virginia, and said that he and his wife had read Last Child and some other books, and they'd gotten inspired, and they started getting their kids and themselves out into nature every weekend. One day, the 5-year-old tugs on his father's pant leg and says, "Dad, how come we're the only family having this much fun?" So he started inviting other families. And today, they have over 600 families on their email list. And what these families do, those are not individuals, whole families. What these families do is they email each other. Sometimes they pick up the phone. Sometimes they do that old-fashioned thing of talk face-to-face. And they arrange to meet at the park on Saturday, several families at a time. and they go for a hike, or they do stream reclamation sometimes, or they garden. In the UK, people are starting what are called green gyms. They're deciding, you know, that treadmill and that inside, that gym is pretty expensive. And so they're starting to do the same thing, and they don't have to have kids, they're just doing it. And they're meeting at a park, or they're meeting at somebody's house and doing gardening, and that's their exercise. These family nature clubs, there are, I think, over 100 of them now, and many of them have several hundred families as members. There are some advantages to this way of connecting to nature. First, I don't think we can pretend that the days of Johnny and Jeannie go outside and don't come back in until the streetlights come on. I don't think those days are going to come back very soon in most neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods, it will. But parents are so scared. They're terrified of stranger danger. And when, in fact, the actual number of stranger abductions has been going down for at least 2 decades. But my profession of journalism and the entertainment media, particularly I think CNN and Fox, will take a handful of terrible crimes against children and repeat those over and over and over again. And that's the very definition of conditioning, because pretty soon we think that there's the boogeyman is right down at the corner every day, every night, and certainly in those woods. Some people think that that's some kind of conspiracy. I don't, because that would attribute too much institutional intelligence to my profession. But it has the effect of conspiracy. In any case, these family nature clubs is a way to get our kids, get ourselves into nature and deal with that fear, because there's perceived safety in numbers. Several families doing it together. One of the interesting things is that what they're finding is that as a family, if you go out just with your own children, the kids do a lot of whining and all of that, and they're very clingy, et cetera, and they complain. But what they're finding was that these multiple families go out together, the kids are off. They're playing hide and seek. They're doing what kids used to do. They're not playing by themselves. It's not that kind of independent play, but it is kids out together making up their own rules. You know, what a concept. Kids, independent play, making up their own games. That doesn't happen very much anymore. So there's another positive thing about these family nature clubs, and I described this in the nature principle, which is the parents are finding that this works for them too. This is a wonderful way to get new friends. It beats the bars, you know? And relationships are starting up, and this social networking that happens in nature is one of the topics of the nature principle. There are other advantages to this kind of approach, and we have to think of a lot of new tools like this. Family nature club's only one idea. Any kind of family can do this. Think how great this is for single-parent families who face enormous difficulties with their logistics. Any kind of culture, any kind of neighborhood, any kind of economic group can do this. And you can go to the Children Nature Network website and you can download a free toolkit to start your own family nature club. And here's the deal that's really neat right now particularly. You don't have to wait for funding. You don't have to wait for approval. You can do it now and you can do it yourself. I think particularly in this recession, we've got to find tools where we don't have to wait for the self-appointed experts or for government or for foundations, for funders, et cetera. We've got to figure out ways to permeate the culture and not wait for the big institutions to change. So that's one way we can reconnect with nature that is different than in the past. One of the things I talk about a lot in the nature principle is healthcare and the impact of actually 2 areas. One is the impact on intelligence and the impact on our health. Now the studies, most of these are correlative studies rather than causal studies. So we have to be careful about over-claiming what these studies mean. But these correlative studies are pretty much pointing in the same direction, and that's rather rare. The truth is that not enough research has been done in this area of the benefits of the natural world to human beings. Until about 12 or 15 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, this was virtually ignored by the scientific community. There are reasons for this that I think. One is it's where the funding comes from. You know, what toy can you sell? What pill can you prescribe for nature? Another one is that science has kind of had blinders on, I think, about this issue. I worked with some neuroscientists, a dozen of the best ones in the country, who were working on brain architecture development for children a few years ago. And I would ask them, you're looking at all kinds of things, how daycare, how attachment to parents, attachment to caregivers, et cetera, how stress in a family affects literally the development of brain architecture. Have you ever looked at how the natural world affects that? And they would look at me with a blank stare. And then they would say, what's nature? And so I would say to the neuroscientists, this isn't brain surgery. I don't know, come up with a definition, 150 trees per acre. You know, you do this in other areas. The irony is that these guys were actually in the lab already thinking in this direction. They were creating in their control group what they considered more natural conditions for the monkeys and the rats and the pigeons that they were stressing out over in this group in order to see what happens. So they were already thinking about a more natural environment. Now, it wasn't very natural, but at least they were thinking in that way. But when you ask them about outside, about the environment outside, about nature itself, they drew a blank. And the problem is that they can't define nature. There are now apparently almost 30 definitions of life. Science can't really define life right now. You know, I always thought you knew it when you saw it. But this is a real problem for science. And I think that those blinders need to come off. I think we need to have a lot more studies of this. The parameters can be defined. But the kinds of studies that are coming out really suggest that spending more time in nature can stimulate our ability to learn. The studies at the University of Illinois on attention deficit disorder show that just a little bit of contact with nature in kids as young as 5 years old, and they're studying children in the projects of Chicago, that these symptoms of attention deficit disorder get better. And the people doing those studies say that nature therapy ought to be added to the other two traditional therapies for attention deficit disorder, which are Ritalin and other stimulants and behavioral modification. I agree with that. I mean, they're not saying do away with these other stimulants. They're saying add to that, and I think that's a good idea. But I would also ask, could it be that at least some of the huge increase in the number of kids being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and being handed Ritalin, some schools, 30% of the boys are on Ritalin or some other stimulant. Could it be that at least some of that increase, not all, but some of that increase might have something to do with the fact that we took nature away from kids in the first place? That we've so radically changed their lives in such a short period of time? And the same is true for antidepressants for kids. A few years ago, I was in San Francisco, and I picked up a magazine, and it was one of those magazines you wonder where they come from, in the hotel room. And this was San Francisco magazine, and on the back page was a black and white photograph of a little boy on a beach. And he was running along this beach, and behind him you could see the storm waves coming in and the storm clouds out at sea. But his eyes were filled with life. And the story next to this photograph said that this little boy had a problem. He couldn't sit still. He was disruptive in class, and the school finally kicked him out. Now, parents were distraught, of course, but they'd been very observant parents. And so they, for the next 10 years, because they had seen how nature helped their little boy calm himself and focus, for the next 10 years, they took their little boy all over the West to many of the great wilderness areas of the West. And the little boy turned out okay. The photograph was taken in 1906, and the little boy's name was Ansel Adams. So here's a couple questions. What would have happened to little Ansel if they had put him in a cubicle called a classroom, given him drugs, told him to sit still throughout years of school, shut down or cut back on recess, shut down or cut back on field trips, tested him all the time? Would we have the gifts of nature that Ansel Adams gave us, that nature gave him? Would we have the kind of political support we have now for the national park system without Ansel Adams? And here's the other question. How many other little Ansels and Anselettes are out there right now who could give us great gifts in the future if we give them the gift of nature? Now, the nature principle is primarily, not solely, because I still talk about kids in it, but it's mainly about adults. And the reason for that is Seattle. Many places that I went when I first started talking about Last Child, an adult would stand up or come up to me later and they said, "What about us?" And in Seattle, I don't remember where it was, but this is early on, I was signing books at an event, and a woman literally came over and grabbed my lapels and almost picked me up and said, "Listen to me, adults have nature deficit disorder too. You need to write a book about that." So I wrote it down and put it in my wallet, that idea. It's a pretty good idea. So there's two reasons that I wrote the nature principle, to really look at not only the scientific evidence, because I don't base this book just on studies, just on scientific evidence. It's very important, but science can be tricky. It changes its mind. Remember what they announced about salty diets about a week ago? They're back. We will rush out right now and have a high salt dinner because science says it's important to do. Suddenly. We need to, I think, trust our intuition. We also need to trust millennia of human experience. We've known this all along, that nature helped our mental health, helped our physical health, and most importantly, helps us feel more alive. I think that there are several reasons that it helps both people learn and helps them be more physically and psychologically healthy. One is that other than a New York subway, when else do you use all of your senses at the same time? As you do when you're outside in nature, unless you have your iPods plugged in. I tell the story in one of the first chapters, which is called Singing for Bears in the Nature Principle, about my son and I, my younger son. He's the son who I knew he had the fishing gene because when he was 3, I caught him fishing in the humidifier. We're going up a stream in Alaska on Kodiak, which is a wonderful, it's almost like Jurassic Park there. It's an amazing place, except the animals are real and not genetically, I want to clarify that. So we're going up this stream, and this is a place where it has a lot of bears, Alaskan brown bears. These are the kind that are 50 feet tall, and they have you over for lunch. And you really want to be careful. The main thing you want to do is not surprise those bears. With or without cubs, you don't want to surprise them. So you do things like you wear bear bells that jingle. In Alaska, they call those bear tums. They don't really work. But you talk and you sing for bears. You break all the rules of fishing because you make a lot of noise, because you don't want to surprise the bears. So the guide taught us an added thing that we needed to do. He taught us how to smell for bears. And once you've smelled that smell, you never forget it. It is kind of a combination of bear musk and rotten salmon, because they love to roll in the salmon. And it's a very peculiar smell. And he said, when you smell, that means one of two things. Either the bear is right there in the bushes, or it's just left. So you better start singing. Well, it turns out that a study was done that sometime after Matthew and I got home of using college students, and they found that we have a little bloodhound in us. We're not as good at tracking with our nose as bloodhounds, but we can do it with blindfolds on. There are a lot of senses that we block out every day. The scientists who look at the senses no longer talk about 5 senses, and maybe that's 6 metaphorical one. They talk about as many as 30 senses. Some of these have to do with our use of our ears to know where we are it's called echolocation. Some people who have lost their sight are learning how to do this. This can be trained. There are a lot of senses, and I won't go into them, but when we're sitting in front of that computer day after day, and I love computers, I'm not anti-tech. I do love my iPhone, too much. But when we are tunneling into that screen day after day, we're not using all of our senses. Certainly not at the same time. We're literally blocking the world out. But when we are in nature, we are using those senses at the same time. In terms of how this helps us learn, we'll talk more about that in the discussion. But I talk about not the end of technology, but I talk about looking forward. What if we, as part of our learning how to learn and learning about the world, we did immerse students and ourselves in nature as much as we do technology? And I call that the hybrid mind in the book. The best illustration of this I've heard is I met a guy who trains people how to be pilots of cruise ships. And he said he gets 2 kinds of students. He says, I get the kind of student that grew up inside with electronics. And he said, those students are really good at the electronics in the boat, in the ship. And I need that, he said. And then I get another kind of student. And this student grew up outside, hunting, fishing, hiking, whatever, but mainly grew up outside. And that student has a talent too. That student actually knows where the ship is. And he wasn't being cute. He meant literally, they have a spatial sense of where the ship is. And it turns out there's a cluster of senses that are studied that have to do with our awareness of where we are in space. I want to end this part of it, and I'll get more into the health and some of those other issues and how we can maybe create that society. But I wanted to end this by reading something from the book. It was going to be the introduction of the book, but I put it in deeper. It's called The Garden, and it opens the section on health, on vitamin N, as I call it. Memories are seeds. When I was a boy, the good times in my family were, more often than not, associated with nature, with fishing trips, discovered snakes, and captured frogs, with dark water touched by stars. We lived at the edge of the suburbs in Raytown, Missouri. At the end of our backyard, cornfields began, and then came the woods, and then more farms that seemed to go on forever. Every summer, I ran through the fields with my collie, elbowing the forest of whipping stalks and leaves to dig my underground forts and climb into the arms of an oak that had outlived Jesse James. When the corn harvest was over, my father and I would walk through the stubble and search for the ground nests and speckled eggs of Kildare. Together we watched with admiration as the parents attempted, with tragic cries and faked broken wings, to lead us away from their nests. I recall my father's dark tan neck creased with lines of dust as he tilled our garden. I ran ahead of him, pulling rocks and bones and toys from his path. My father, mother, little brother, and I planted strawberry starts and buried seeds for butternut squash and our own sweet corn. One year, my father read about the productivity of Swiss chard and, as was his way, became fully committed. That summer, we bagged Swiss chard for weeks. Our kitchen and part of our basement overflowed with it. My mother canned it. I carried brown shopping bags full of Swiss chard to the neighbors. My mother loved to tell the story about the summer the Swiss chard ate the neighborhood. Controlled by no community association, our yard was humbled by locusts and heat and other natural covenants. With all my senses, I recall a late afternoon when my father and mother and my brother and I raced the weather to complete the construction of a retaining wall for sod and garden. We placed limestone slabs into a line to hold back erosion. We felt the wind quicken and the air change and stood up together. Near the end, we wiped sweat from our foreheads and stared at the quilted pea-green sky, felt a queasy stillness and a sudden burst of wind. And then we saw the hail advancing yard to yard like an invading army, and we rushed to the basement door. Such moments became part of the family lore because our time in the garden and on the water and in the woods held our family together. After a while, my father, who worked as a chemical engineer, earned more money and ventured out of the house less. The garden faded, replaced by Kentucky bluegrass sod. Neighbors erected chain-link fences. Our collie no longer ran free, and neither did we. Instead of Swiss chard and uneven bumps of earth for pumpkins and squash, the yard became ordered and lined with evenly spaced shrubs. Instead of planting vegetables, we pulled dandelions, eliminated the variances, enforced order. The summer sun came to feel oppressive. My mother told the story of the Swiss chard on fewer occasions and then not at all. The garden became a dim memory. We moved to a larger house. While I was away at college, the job market for chemical engineers dried up. My father had always dreamt of retirement, of moving to the Ozarks. He believed that once there, he would fish all day and plant a large garden. So he and my mother and brother moved to the mountains of southern Missouri to Table Rock Lake. By then, however, my father was spending most of his hours at the kitchen table staring. He caught few fish, he planted no garden. He and my mother moved back to the suburbs. A dozen years later, as I sat in the desk chair where he had taken his own life, I opened a drawer. There I found a handwritten document titled Accounts Due. It was a bitter ledger of his days, a reduction of our family into numbers. But tucked into those paragraphs was a sentence that mentioned a good period of his life, what he called his one brief Eden. I looked at the sentence for a while. I knew when that was. I'm now older than my father was when he died. My life and writing have been shaped by that time at the edge of the cornfields. Sometimes it seems to me that what happened to my father, the disappearance of nature in his life and his descent into illness, parallels the life of our culture. As children's freedom to roam has diminished, as families have pulled inward, as nature has become an abstraction. I understand that this equation is incomplete. Which came first, the illness or the withdrawal from nature? I honestly don't know the answer to that question, but I often wonder what my father's life would have been like if the vernacular of mental health therapy had extended beyond Thorazine and Quaaludes and into the realm of nature therapy. As a boy, I must have sensed nature's power to heal. As I watched my father withdraw, I wished that he would quit his job as an engineer and become a forest ranger. Somehow I believe that if he were to do that, then he would be all right, and we would be all right. I realize now, of course, that nature alone would not have cured him, but I have no doubt it would have helped. Perhaps these childhood experiences are why, as an adult, I am compelled to believe in the restorative power of nature, in a human-nature reunion, and that because of this reunion, life will be better. Thank you.